to welcome you all to the launch of College Health and Sport Week. I'm here at Front Square. Many of you I know are working from home or studying from home, so won't have the opportunity to be on campus. But campus is still here, as you can see, and it's looking forward to you coming back, hopefully for the first semester of next year. So today I'm in Front Square, and I'm really looking forward to listening to Professor Shane O'Mara's talk on walking while you're walking. Michelle Tanner from the Director of Sport and myself would really like to thank Martina and her committee for creating such an eclectic program for College Health and Sport Week this week. There really is something for everybody. We have the Trinitones pop-up choir, and from that we've got a comedy debate from the Phil on trends in eating and the politics associated with them. We've got discussions on elite sport, and we've got making the most of your garden. If you add the free exercise sport, so we really like to thank the committee for organizing that. So today I'm really delighted to introduce you all to Professor Shane O'Mara. Shane is the Professor of Experimental Brain Research, and he's the Director of the Trinity Institute of Neuroscience. Shane's research focuses on the relations between cognition, synaptic plasticity, and behavior in the context of brain aging and depression. So how does this all link into walking and its benefits? So Shane's beautiful book, which many of you I'm sure have read, called In Praise of Walking, the new science of how we walk and why it's good for us, not alone explains the science and benefits of walking to us, but also focuses on how the science and evidence related to walking need to be turned into policy by our urban planners. Finally, I suppose it's been such a strange year, an incredibly strange year since we closed the college on the 5th of March over a year ago, and then reopened and temporarily closed and reopened again. Many of us have grown to love walking in the past year. It's probably one of the very few beneficial side effects of COVID-19. Many of us have grown to love walking, whether it's with our dogs or walking on our own. And many of you will be using apps and competing with each other with regard to your walking. And I suppose the one thing I've noticed with Irish people this year, in comparison to previously, the weather doesn't seem to be affecting them when they're walking. And I think we're very much into the Scottish mode or Billy Connolly mode of there's no such thing as bad weather, only the wrong clothes. And I think that's really been a fantastic aspect of people's just get up and go in COVID. They're just doing things. And so I'm delighted to hand over to Shane so that he can enlighten us as we walk along here. Thank you, Shane.
Thank you for that introduction, David, and thank you to Martina and Louise for the invitation to speak with you here today. So what I want to do is give you a kind of a bit of a whistle-stop tour about why we should all be interested in walking, and what the science of walking has to tell us about why it might be good for us, and why it's good for us should be thought of in its most expansive way possible, why it's good for us as individuals, but also why walking is good for us as members of our societies. So let's just start with perhaps a slightly old-fashioned view of walking. The quote at the top here is from the British anthropologist John Napier from 1967. And he says, human walking is a unique activity during which the body step by step teeters on the edge of catastrophe. And I've illustrated that below with a GIF from, or a short movie of John Cleese doing the Ministry for Silly Walks. And you'll see that despite the remarkable movements that Cleese is able to make with his legs and feet, he doesn't fall over. So I think Napier's quote is kind of a little bit right, but mostly wrong. Now, when you look at Cleese here for a moment, I want you to do something you've probably never thought about. Draw an imaginary line from his ear, from the center of his ear, the auditory canal, to the corner of his eye, the canthus of the eye. and watch what happens to that despite the movements he makes. What you'll see is, irrespective of his leg throwing and all of the other things that he does, that line is maintained approximately parallel to the ground. And when it deviates from that parallel position, the brain works to bring it back to that position. So the first, I suppose, important thing to realize about walking and indeed balance is that although we might intuitively feel that we're built from our feet up, in fact, we're actually hung from the head down. And a good way of thinking of the head is that it's a kind of a guidance platform that seeks out a substrate, namely the ground, and keeps itself stable relative to an internal sense, which we'll come and talk about in a little while. Now, let's just dive back many millions of years. We're land-dwelling animals, and for us, I think the prejudice is that we would think of walking as first evolving on land. But to give away my punchline early, that's not correct. And we know this from genetic and genomic studies over the past couple of years. Firstly, there are lots of bottom dwellers, benthic animals that walk on the ocean floor. You're obviously well aware of crabs and lobsters and creatures like this doing it. The rosy-lipped batfish here on my left walks on the ocean floor using its fins. And this absolutely gorgeous animal, the sea pig, an almost transparent animal which feeds on marine waste, walks using these soft limbs across the ocean floor. Now, how do we get to an understanding of the relationship between walking and evolution? Well, one of the best tools we have is modern genomic analysis. Here on the left, again, my left, is a view flow of the sea skate walking along the floor of the aquarium that it's positioned in. And on the right, we have mice doing what mice do, tumbling and falling and jumping and all of those kinds of things. Now, these are very different creatures. The mouse is a mammal. It's warm-blooded and it lives on land. The skate is a cold-blooded creature and it lives on the ocean floor. But there are commonalities. They both have spinal cords and they both walk along the ocean, walk along the ground by pushing limbs against the ground. And the question which can now be asked and answered is whether or not the substrates in the spinal cord of the skate are similar to those of a land-dwelling mammal and vice versa. And what we see is, in fact, yes, that the genes that control the expression of the patterning of the spinal cord and limbs in the skate and in the mouse are actually remarkably similar, to the point that they really are genetically identical. And various calculations using molecular clocks and other means suggest that the last common ancestor, vertebrate ancestor, of the skate and the mouse existed about 400 or 420 million years ago, which means that when evolution hit on an answer for movement that it liked, it kept it. So the program for walking appears to have first evolved in the sea at least 420 million years ago, and not at the margins of the sea and land, where it had been speculated for many years that this is in fact where walking might first have evolved. Now let's just talk about land animals for a moment. I want to bring you down to County Kerry. And there's a remarkable trackway which I suggest you should all visit if you ever get the chance. One of only 4 in the world of tetrapod, which is the name given to this creature for which we only have trace fossils. We don't actually have fossil remains in terms of bones. This was discovered by accident by a Swiss student about 25 years ago. And there's only one of 4 in the world. There's one in South America, there's one in China, and there's another, I think, in Poland. And a variety of calculations show that the animal looked possibly something like the animal on this trackway sign up on the top left. It undulated as it moved along the land. And this site in Kerry is really quite something. It's on Valentia Island. And here's a picture by a fossil guy, just giving you another view of the footprints that you can see on the sedimentary rock when you go to visit the tetrapod. It's sometimes claimed that we don't have fossils in Ireland, and I think that's possibly because we haven't looked very hard. Here's a recent discovery of an amphibian in County Clare. You can see the bones there on the left, and an artist's representation of what an amphibian might have looked like in the main picture. Now, let's move from evolution to development. How did you learn to walk? Assuming that you learn to walk between approximately the age of 1 and 2 years, you probably have no memory of how it is that you learn to walk. Now let's put walking in context. And the context is this: to learn to speak, you need to be exposed to a language community. If you're not, you won't learn to speak particularly effectively or well, or you may not learn to speak at all. By contrast, where walking is concerned, you have something very different going on. A kind of a developmental program unfolds. And Karen Adolph and our group have shown in a beautiful series of studies, but I've chosen this one because the title says it all. How do you learn to walk? You learn to walk making thousands of steps and having dozens of falls per day. And these falls are not, contra John Napier, catastrophic. They're typically injury-free. And this is how you study this. You put an infant into a laboratory where it's got lots of surfaces to walk on and climb on, and you track it over hours, days, weeks, months, and you look at the change in the movement that the child engages in over that time. You track it using video cameras. And what you find is something astonishing. That locomotor experience is astounding in 12 to 19-month-olds. They average around about 2,400 steps per hour, and they fall approximately 17 times per hour. This is really, really something quite remarkable, and something that's not appreciated about how it is that we learn to walk. Now, let's look at adult walking for a moment. This is an example of kind of beauty that can arise in human walking. This is somebody from Mary Hayhoe's lab, a participant walking on a very rough surface. You can see there are rocks strewn all over the ground here. And this chap is wearing a mobile laboratory, so he can be tracked as he moves through the environment. And he's moving at quite a decent pace from the start to the finish point. And you can see here in a moment that he'll land at the finish point. And while moving, the position of his arms and legs, of course, have been tracked, and he's wearing a mobile laboratory on his back. He's also wearing an eye tracker. And you can see here that the decision regarding where you place your foot is made about 1/5 of a second ahead of where you actually place your foot. So this is a really, really rapid process where the person gazes out about 2 meters, flicks their gaze back, and then the foot is placed. And we do this stably, and we do this pretty reliably. It requires attention. Of course, if you don't look where you're going, you may actually fall. But again, contra Napier, disaster does not await if you actually pay attention while you're engaged in this kind of task. This kind of movement, of course, is something that robots are not yet capable of. Now, as adults, how much do you walk? I regret to say the news is very depressing. There's lots and lots of data now from smartphones and other sources asking just this precise question. And in high-income countries, and indeed in many low to middle-income countries, people walk very little. They walk about 4,500 steps a day on average, with the Japanese coming in probably at the upper end at around about 6,000 steps per day, and Saudi Arabia coming in at around 3,000 steps a day, probably because there's very poor walking infrastructure in Saudi Arabia's cities. And this has a marked impact on how much walking you can do. The infrastructure makes a difference. If you live in a high walkable city like New York or Boston, you will walk a lot in the morning, you will walk a lot at lunchtime, and you will walk in the evenings. And you will walk pretty persistently during the course of the weekends as well. You will walk substantially more than in car-bound cities. So a point that I want to make early, and one I'll make again, is that built environment has a dramatic effect on how much walking we can do. We shouldn't just focus on what individuals do. We need to focus also on what the environment around us affords us the opportunity to do. And just a little recent data from Hadza hunter-gatherers, you'll see on average males and females walk several times more per day than the average Westerners here in the black line. And this is an age axis and a step axis. You'll see there's one chap in this right-hand graph for males and men and boys who clocks up in the course of one day 60,000 steps, which is about 40 miles. It's a very, very considerable amount of movement. But you can see relative to Westerners, they had to move much more, and their heart health is remarkably better than the average Westerner. Now, let's change from thinking about the heart and think about mental health for a moment. It's often said that if you're feeling somewhat dysphoric, a good walk will help shift that. And what's the evidence for that? Well, I'm going to contrast two studies. One is a small study conducted at Iowa State University, which focuses on what they call incidental ambulation. Here, students are brought to the laboratory, and they either have to walk around the campus making judgments of the beauty or otherwise of buildings on the campus, or they sit at a table and they study pictures and make the same judgments. And they estimate self-report how good they're feeling in that moment. And what you find is the people who engage in incidental walking, which is ancillary to a separate task, end up feeling much better than those who are seated for the same or similar periods of time. A short walk can offer quite a boost to how you feel. And this is true even in people who, in other studies, they found who, quote, dread walking. Those who dislike the thought of walking still end up wanting or feeling better as a result of having walked. Now, does exercise have a more profound effect than the effect suggested in a study of a limited study of that type? Well, the answer is yes. There's quite a literature now showing that physical activity, and the principal physical activity focused on in this study by Harvey and his colleagues is walking, suggests that about 12% of future cases of depression could be avoided if individuals in the population at large engaged in as little as 1 hour of physical activity a week. It's really a quite remarkable result in a cohort group of about 34,000 participants, none of whom at the start of the study had any mental health issues. Their conclusion is very straightforward, that regular leisure time activity of any intensity provides protection against future depression. And this is quite, again, an important result, that not alone is physical activity, aerobic exercise of any intensity good for your physical well-being, it's also good for your mental well-being as well. Now, it's often been thought that walking can boost creativity. And of course, if you look through the autobiographies of many of the writers and poets and artists and others, even mathematicians, as we'll see, of over the years, many of them love to engage in walking. I'll turn to a local member of Trinity, or sometime member of Trinity, Hamilton, the famous mathematician. Hamilton invented, of course, many different types of mathematics, but in particular, he pondered the issue of quaternions for many years. I'm not a mathematician, so I'm not going to pretend I really understand quaternions at all, but just enough to say that quaternions violate the ordinary rules, or the normal rules of ordinary arithmetic. The mathematics are very alien, such that a simple number like result like 3 plus 4 does not equal 4 plus 3 in quaternions. Hamilton was also an amazing walker. and used to walk from Dunsink, the observatory, to Trinity and the Royal Irish Academy most days, a walk of about 2 hours duration. And he would consider the Quaternion, or theory of quaternions, while walking. And one day on this walk, he discovered the equation and lacked a pen, but had his tobacco knife. So he cut the equation into a stone on Broom Bridge. And he says something remarkable in his autobiography, or at least his short autobiographical writings, on this discovery. He says that as he walked, it dawned on him the notion that we must admit a fourth dimension of space for calculating with triples. And then he catches the aha moment for creativity beautifully. An electric circuit seemed to close and a spark flashed forth. Now, for the average person who's not a creative mathematician, will walking help you problem solve? And to cut to the end of the story quickly, the answer is yes, it will. If you take people to the laboratory and do standard tests of creative thinking, you can show by use of tasks like the convergent thinking task or divergent thinking task that there are many reliable differences between individuals in their ability to generate novel uses for common household objects. However, if you ask people to first go for a 10-minute walk prior to engaging in this task, what you find is the number of divergent that they produce, or uses that they produce, approximately doubles. This is also true on a treadmill, although walking outside might be a little more interesting than being on a treadmill. And it's also true for the generation of novel analogies. It's sometimes suggested that older people are less creative. This probably rests more on stereotype than in good evidence. And a group in Taiwan have replicated the Opezzo and Schwartz finding, where they show that older adults in their late 60s and early 70s perform about twice as well as young adults in their late teens or early 20s on the self-same task when they're allowed to walk for a couple of minutes prior to engaging in an alternative uses divergent thinking task. Now let's move gear again just for a moment to think about how we get around in the world. You might think that vision is the sense that's most important to you for navigating the world, and you might be wrong. And we can test this by looking at navigation in people who have a visual impairment that arises or arose since birth, so that they're congenitally blind, that happens since birth so that they become adventitiously blind, and sighted if you ask the sighted person to wear a blindfold. And a simple way of assessing this is to ask them to, each individual, to undertake a triangle completion task. So you start at an origin, you walk so many meters, and you make a turn at a certain angle, and then you stop, and your job is to find your way back to the origin. And actually, if you think about it, you probably know that you shouldn't be too bad at this task. You can find your way out of a darkened room, for example. You know where the relative position of the door is. And it turns out, quite remarkably, that congenitally blind, adventitiously blind, normally sighted individuals wearing blindfolds perform at approximately the same level over short distances of up to 6 meters or so on tasks like this. The conclusion Loomis and his colleagues came to was that there were small performance differences occasionally, but they weren't consistent and they weren't large. And the data show that there's little indication that spatial competence depends on prior visual experience. This is because it may not be visually driven. It may be a convergence of differing senses coming together to create our sense of where we are in the world. So here's a study by Alain Berthoz and his colleagues, where they take normal participants, they sit them in a robuter, which is a little robot-driven chair. They blindfold them, they put on earmuffs, and then they impose, using the robot, a movement profile, a triangular profile, for example, or a square wave profile. And then they ask the person to reproduce, using a joystick, this movement that they've just undergone. And it turns out we're really good at doing this. We can remember movements that have been imposed on the body, and we can reproduce them very well. Again, over at least short distances of up to about 6 or so meters without any visual input. And this has given rise, or is a part of the evidence base for the idea that the brain has a GPS system, that it creates maps of the world that allow us to move around in the world using input from differing senses. Vision is important, but movement is another one that is profoundly important as well. So Tolman at the University of California at Berkeley in the late 1940s published a famous paper on the idea that there are cognitive maps in the brain. And this was the kind of task that he used to test whether or not cognitive maps were present. A rat would be introduced into the opening arm of this apparatus. It would run forward, it would make a left turn, it would run forward, it would make a right turn, and it would retrieve a food pellet from one of an array of bins that it could potentially walk into. And Tolman then wanted to know, was the animal going to where the food was because the motor movements that it had engaged in were being rewarded, or was it doing something else? Was it inferring a layout of the map of the environment that it was using to navigate around the world? He cheated by closing off the original arm and asking the rat to choose one of these arms. And what he found was, very consistently, that rats will choose the arm that is most likely to bring them to where the food is, as opposed to any of the other arms. And they can do this very quickly. And he suggested, based on data like these, that the rat was inferring something like a layout map of the environment which it used to navigate in. In other words, it wasn't concentrating on the movements it had made previously. What it was doing was actually figuring out, in perhaps Cartesian or other terms, where things were relative to each other, and then where it was relative to those things. A number of years later, John O'Keefe, the Irish-American neuroscientist, made a really quite remarkable discovery, which is that there is a part of the brain which contains cells which are interested in where you are in space, not what you're doing, whether you're breathing or thinking or sitting down or eating or whatever, but just where you are relative to the outside world. And he called these cells place cells, and they're really quite remarkable. Here's an example. Here's a rat walking around in an environment retrieving food pellets. And that noise you can hear is a cell discharging, a single cell in the hippocampus. So it's silent everywhere in the environment apart from this upper right quadrant. And other laboratories have shown that there are other classes of cells interested in spatial responses as well. So in the anterior thalamus, a brain region I won't talk much about again, you have head direction cells. If you listen. These are cells which have a compass-like function, and they tell you where you're heading or your orientation relative to the environment that you're in. So here's two components of the GPS system in the brain: place cells telling you where you are, and head direction cells telling you approximately where you're oriented. And there's a third component which has recently been described by May-Britt Moser and Edvard Moser, which are the so-called grid cells. These provide a metric for space. So they measure movement that you've engaged in through space. These have been predicted by O'Keefe and others. And both O'Keefe and the Mosers went on to win the Nobel Prize in 2014 for the discovery of these different components of the brain's GPS system. Now that kind of allows me to segue to a picture of our world. You can see that the world is urbanizing very dramatically and quickly. And the share of the population living in urban areas is now a majority of the world's population for the first time in human history. which means that most of our walking will be urban. It will be in town and it will be in cities. And our streets used to be terrible for walkers. If you go to London, you'll see these things, boot scrapers, which were placed there because people used to empty chamber pots out of windows, and you might end up with the contents of the chamber pots landing on your head. But our streets are often still terrible for walkers. And I just want to focus here briefly on why this might be. If we look across the world, what we see is most people, or everywhere, people are living longer. And average age of death has risen dramatically over the past 50 years. There's obviously some bounce in the data, but the general trajectory is clear, with Japan again kind of leading the pack with an average age of death at around 86 or so. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that there's a large population that have been overlooked by our urban planners. And these are people who are aging. Here's, I think, a very important study by Laura Asher and her colleagues, where they took a large group of adults aged 65 plus in the UK, 3,145, and they tested walking speeds. And they found that 84% of males in this group and 94% of females had a walking impairment. And what they then showed is that road crossings are set for people who can walk at least 1.2 meters per second. And the vast majority of the older adults tested walked at below this speed, which means that when you think about it, if we do not build our design features for our towns and cities around the needs of those who are most likely to manifest difficulties in individual mobility, we have decided that we are going to imprison them in their homes because getting around is just going to be too hard. Now, am I being fanciful or overstated in making that remark? I don't think so. This is my hometown of Galway, a view down the Corrib. And here's the wonderful Font Junction. This was recently rebuilt, and the pedestrian walkway has been removed, so that if you start here at the start point and try to get here to where the shops are, it will take an able-bodied adult approximately 14 minutes to cross. And you see this all over Ireland, but you see it also all over the world, where the movement of cars is prioritized over the movement of individuals. Just beyond these trees, there's a large housing estate. Now imagine if you're in a wheelchair and you want to go to the shops over here. This has become an impossible task. So I will just summarize that polemical point by saying that pedestrians are too often ignored in favor of motorists. And yet, if we look at Dublin, where are our favorite places? Or where do people like to congregate? We like to congregate around other people. We don't like to congregate on the M50. We don't like to congregate on the edge of the N11. What we like to do is be around others. Pedestrians like to be around other people. Humans like to be around other people. We don't like to be around cars. This is a picture of Taormina in Sicily. I love the old towns in Italy. This phenomenon of the passeggiata in the evenings, where people go out to walk. Note what is missing. There are no cars. These old medieval cities do not allow them to be present. So what I want to suggest is that our towns and cities need to adopt a design principle, which is given by this acronym of EASE. Our towns and cities should be easy to walk. They should be accessible to all. That means the elderly, it means people with mobility impairments, it means people with visual impairments, it means everybody. They should be safe for everyone, again, including all the groups that the towns and cities should be accessible to. And of course, our towns and cities should be enjoyable for all. Paris is attempting this transformation at the moment, the 15-minute city vision, where everything should be within 15 minutes of your front door. And in Ireland, Limerick is actually doing a remarkably good job on trying to do just this. This is one of the signs that you'll see for a walk around Limerick, where the people who live in Limerick have been pleasantly surprised to discover that they can walk between places faster than they can drive between them. So this is quite an amazing phenomenon. Leave your car behind and walk. You'll be the better for it. Now, let's just, I'm coming into the last couple of minutes, so let's just switch gear a little and ask a question. Why do you have a brain? Put it a different way. What problem does having a brain solve for you? If you look out your window, hopefully you'll have a view of some trees and plants and things. You'll see they're not moving. Why is that? Well, let's look at a really beautiful creature. This is the sea squirt, found off the coast of California and other places. And in its early life, it looks something like this when it's in its larval stage. It has a spinal cord. It has a semi-developed brain. And at a certain point in its life, it undergoes a transition where it sticks itself using these adhesive spots to a rock. And one of the first things it does when it sticks itself to a rock is that it absorbs its own brain and spinal cord as a meal. And it becomes little more than a kind of a vegetative grabber of whatever happens to pass in through its front-like mouth. I think there's an important clue here. If you like to be like Homer Simpson, what's the consequence for you? Well, we now know, we've known this actually since time immemorial, that long periods of being bedridden induces frailty. This is a study by De Mangle and colleagues in France, and they have healthy males in their late 20s and early 30s lie in this dry waterbed for 3 days, and they measure muscle volume, muscle strength, and muscle viscoelasticity. So this is the property by which something which is deformed can resume its prior shape. And they show that for just 3 days of dry immersion, that muscle volume, muscle strength, and muscle viscoelasticity drop significantly. So frailty caused by prolonged periods of being in bed or through other issues is a significant problem, and one that has been, I think, tremendously overlooked. Let's just look at a slightly different thing. And this is the issue of dementia prevention. The Lancet Commission over the last number of years has focused on how we might prevent future cases of dementia, just like the Hunt study focused on preventing future cases of depression. And they've developed a life course model of the modifiable factors that we can change that will reduce the risk of dementia. Hearing loss was one I was very surprised by, that about 9% of cases arise from the loss of hearing in midlife. So screening for hearing is something that is very important. But what they do place movement, physical activity, at the core of the recommendations, because activity, which is good for the heart, is also good for the brain in all sorts of ways, some of which are only just being teased now. For example, through decreases in brain inflammation. So we do need, as a society, to figure out how it is that we can get people to move more. But I think the key point that I really want to get across here is that unlike what I'm doing at the moment, which is being seated, what we should be doing is standing and moving about more. I'm going to stop there, and I'd be delighted to take questions. I have a regular newsletter at brainpizza.substack.com, and you can find me on Instagram at Shane Writer and on Twitter at Shane O'Mara 3. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shane.
What happens now?
I'm expect. Louise, can you hear me, or Martina?
Yes, I can hear you there. Yes, sorry.
Okay. So am I on the screen now?
Yes, you are. Yeah.
All right. Sorry. Thanks. Thank you so much, Shane. I've moved inside just to do the last piece, just so that we could look at the chat and answer the questions. It was such an interesting whistle-stop tour of embryology, psychiatry, mathematics, social geography, and all linked to walking. It was so interesting. So we've some interesting questions coming in through the chat if you have a couple of moments. So I just wanted to kick off myself and just asking you, in your own work, do you use the action of walking in your own work, whether it's as a scientist or whether it is in writing your walking books?
I use it absolutely for writing. What I typically do is I make out notes on a series of A4 sheets. I staple them together. I get my trusty dictaphone and I go for a walk and I dictate. And I end up with a big load of horrible text. It's terrible. I have verbal tics. I use the word "so" all the time, it appears. But it's a really good way of thinking because you typically end up going far beyond the notes that you've made. And you end up with a lot of words. So the walking book is about 70,000 words long, but the first draft was about 110,000. So
that's very interesting. And that links in with another question we've got in from Martina, actually. Do you walk during meetings? And if you do, how do you take notes? Well, we know how you take notes now. You use the dictaphone.
Well, I would love to walk during meetings, but there's an inertia that stops us doing this. But I think we should be doing more walking meetings than we do.
One of the things we had tried to do at the start of COVID, particularly when we went into level 5 in the autumn again, was to go with the government recommendations and try to limit people's use of cars and public transport, to leave public transport available for essential healthcare staff at that time when there was very little public transport available. And we brought in a walking and a cycling policy really for our staff. Is there much evidence that bringing these policies forward in a university setting can have an impact, or have you come across anything like that?
There's kind of bits and pieces of anecdotal evidence from various places saying this, but I think the big problem is the university is embedded in a much larger urban ecosystem. Yeah. And there are disastrous places for people in wheelchairs, people on crutches, people on bikes, everywhere we look. The one that really bugs me is the corner of Ely Place and Bagot Street. Yes. A really, really pedestrianized, busy area. And the footpath is about 18 inches wide at its narrowest. It's terrible. So we've kind of taken a decision that we give 20 or 25% of our urban space to cars. And we never really appreciate the cost of that, because the cost is absorbed by the mobility problems that all of us on foot have. So we really need to rethink how we do this.
We did try to influence Dublin City Council's policy on footpaths around that time, and many of the footpaths around college have been widened, which has been helpful. A couple of the other questions coming through: is there any research on music, walking, and creativity? You had already said about walking, as in, does listening to music while walking aid or hinder creativity? I'm a bit conscious of that because a lot of our students say that it's all counterintuitive to us older people that listening to music while one is studying is supposed to improve retention. Is there any evidence for walking?
No, there isn't that I'm aware of. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Yes, sure. But I guess it depends on your focus of attention. And one of the important things about creativity is the time away from the task that you're trying to solve is just as important as time on the task. Yeah. So the focus on something else that's getting something else going in your head is I'm assuming, no bad thing, all other things being equal.
And then just a couple of other brief ones, one from Lena, which said, when you spoke about the positive impact of walking on mental health, is there a difference between
a walk as part of another task, such as going to a shop or walking around while at work, or going for a walk?
Again, we don't have good data to kind of differentiate those things. There's some data using experience sampling and mobile phones suggesting that the key thing is walking in a pleasant environment, preferably a green environment with access to trees and other things like that. And that's actually the important thing. But getting up and moving, your body has to work hard and your brain has to work hard to stand up. To maintain balance is not an easy thing for a brain to do. This is why designing robots to do it is hard. Yeah.
Okay, and just the last two questions, which are kind of linked together. One is there any science behind the 10,000 steps a day, and is there a minimum recommended distance that walked every day can improve cognition?
Okay, so that's a great question. So the 10,000 steps originated in Japan in the 1960s, and I think it was because it was a kind of a handy translation for a manufacturer, and I actually think it's a good number anyway. Now there are data. Tremblay and colleagues, for example, have shown that there's a transition at somewhere around 3,000-4,000 steps a day and above, that the all-cause mortality falls the more walking steps you engage in per day. So my usual advice is walk 5,000 steps a day more than you're currently doing, because what you're doing on average isn't very much. It's around about 4,500-5,000 steps. Just walk more. Yeah. You'll do you good.
And just finally from myself then, I was really struck by your slide on older adults' performance when they went for a walk in comparison to younger adults. I thought that was absolutely stunning. And that's a real piece of information that is such a positive message for older people, that their cognition or their divergent thinking can improve. It's not just their physical health or their mood. It's actually their thinking as well.
Their thinking as well, and there's a huge portal circulation to the brain from the heart, and 30% or whatever, 20% of the output of the heart goes to the brain. Irrigating your brain cells with oxygenated blood is a good thing.
Okay. So with that, I'd like to thank Shane so much for a really interesting presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it whilst you were out walking, and hopefully that this is now the start of College Health and Sport Week. You'll continue to walk each day, and not just 10,000 steps. If you're doing 10,000 a day at the moment, unfortunately now you've got to do 15,000.
15, yeah, why not?
Or why not? Exactly. All we need is the time. So thank you so much, and thank you to Martine and Louise for organizing the webinar. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.